Listen, one of the things that was brought up is this issue of security and risk. So as CIOs, as CFOs, as risk officers, tell me your perspective about security in the cloud. Is this just nonsense? Is this real? Is this just a red herring? What are your thoughts?
Well, for us, we look at security in two dimensions. We look at it as security as you traditionally define it, but we also look at it as from the dimension of data loss. I think on the traditional security point of view, I think all the vendors out there who are in the cloud have a vested interest in making sure that they can be trusted. And so that combination of trust, we decided to use them as a vendor. There is some belief that there is a trust between them and us. And so I think the cloud providers probably have better security than our own internal IT departments. And I hate to say it because I know there's a lot of IT people in this room.
I think that's probably true for 99.5% of all organizations.
Yeah. I think so. There is also, over the course of the last few years, there have been multiple certification programs. There's a SAS 70s. There's other mechanisms to get comfortable that security is in place and is adequate for these vendors. I think on the data loss side, that's where probably there should be a little more diligence to make sure there is a backup for the backup. So because really, we're moving our business assets in many ways into the cloud. So I think that's where I worry more and less about the actual, the virtual security, because I believe the virtual security, we both have a vested interest, the vendor and us, to make sure it's done right.
You bring up the whole point about data loss.
Yeah.
What about data access and who is authorized to access secure data, certain data and not? Are there certain protocols or best practices that you've put in place to kind of make sure that only the people who should have access can have access?
Yeah, this goes back to the broader governance issue. Today's world of security and access for data in a business is based on business function. What do you do in the business? It's very hard in today's world to know whether who has access is the right amount of access. And so this goes back to the dependence on the CIO's office. While the CFO may sit there and say, I'm going to drive transformation by going to the cloud, this is where I think the two have to intermingle. And the CIO's office has to be very much a partner in giving us comfort that the right people have access to the information based on what they need.
Ed or Gary, this whole issue of security?
Yeah, following along what Vinay said, I think it is the CIO's responsibility, but I don't think you can just delegate that security aspect to the cloud service provider.
Right.
That I think you have to verify through policy and touching and feeling. I mean, people react to what management inspects, not what they expect. So you need to be looking at it. You're going to be subject to audit. You know, I can't tell how many times I get phone calls from Deloitte that they're auditing some aspect of my world.
There's some Deloitte guys here. So
I apologize to you guys on the Deloitte side, but
I guess it's
a lot of
thing
work.
that they're auditing.
So I think that you can't just assume that it's being done. You've got to validate it's being done, and you can't just I can't answer a Deloitte auditor by saying, yeah, it's taken care of by the cloud service provider. I have to know what the policy is, what the procedure is, what the backup. Are you going, disk to tape? Are you going disk to cloud? How are you backing that process up? I also think you have to be very careful with application security, with your passwords. People push you an awful lot to go to complex passwords. If you go to complex passwords, does that mean they forget it and it's going to be written down on the machine? Something I read recently said that something like 70% of intrusions were done with compromised passwords and credentials. So if you're looking at that, that's something you can control and you need to control.
In your case, you have an awful lot of customer data. Are there certain things that you're doing to help to ensure?
We do. We're trying to deliver a lot of our results now through URL, so as a web presence, as opposed to sending reports or emailing reports. We're putting it out there right now, and we have an obligation to protect that customer's data. So, for instance, we inspect all the vehicles in the state of California. So there's something, I don't know how many million cars there are in California right now, but we have an obligation, we're the custodial of that data, so we have to make sure that all security levels are in place. Otherwise, any kind of breach would just be killer, because on state of California, you've got people's home addresses and you've got credit card information for licensing and registration.
Gary, you have a lot of experience around this issue of data and risk management. And in fact, there are now policies that can be written to help ensure and provide some level of protection. Share a little bit about your experience.
Well, just to, by way of background, as you know, Bill, the first 17 years of my career were focused on managing information security for large organizations, Marietta, Chase Manhattan Bank, Prudential, those kinds, as well as launching that service at the Gartner. You remember about that as well, because you owed me $1.
I did pay you last year.
You did, it's on record. But the reality is, and certainly I've personally come to realize this over the last 3 decades, is the reality is that, from a capabilities and a design perspective, the majority of what we're looking for from a protection and a control standpoint, whether it be access controls, authorizations, secure tunnels, firewalls, encryption, you name it, it's there. From an implementation perspective, it gets kind of sketchy, and then from really kind of a maintenance and monitoring, that's where it starts to really get challenging because of the cost of administration. And the failure, in my opinion, for most of this has been, in the past, has really been in the interoperability of systems. And where do I put this stuff? The CIOs and the technology folks are saying, we've got it, we can figure it out, we can put it out there, but do you want your data encrypted, or you want it done at the application layer, or do you want it done when the connection is done in the VPN? Do you want a physical device sitting on the router? You tell us, we can secure the heck out of this thing. And I think the challenge that I think even myself went after a number of years ago was to try to solve that problem. And I think that's solving for the wrong problem. I think, as you heard before about the challenges of too much data, I really believe now we've got a situation where we're trying to determine what is of greatest value to the organization first. And we've got to kind of prioritize all this activity around everything that supports that value. So if we're going to look at important data, or we're going to look at intellectual property that we want to control, we've got to kind of tunnel through the entire infrastructure to figure out who's got it, where is it, and what policies do we want to implement. So our standard traditional corporate governance structures for protection, good for the base level of the neighborhood, but when you get into anything of value, it now changes. And unless you get some of that direction from the business itself, with relationship to the value, and we talked about security and privacy, but real business value, I don't think you necessarily can put a secure design together. And I think that's where we got to make the connection in order to move forward. And now that it's potentially, I can secure all that in my neighborhood and my house per se, but now as we move into the cloud, into an infrastructure or an application or a system or a service provider, or as we keep moving these dimensions into flexible and adaptable APIs as an example, now I've got to be very specific with that design and what I want to do and how I want to do it. And the second half of that, the last piece, and then I'll stop, is really not only how do I do that, but from really that kind of behavioral aspect of it is how do I do it in a way where folks are going to be motivated to do it, where it's going to be accepted, and it's going to be implemented as well. So I've got kind of 2 things to think about from because those that are providing me cloud services, I might have any leverage over per se. So I've got to accept some of the traditional ways things are going to be done and secured, and I've got to influence them in a way that I never had to influence them before.